CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's up, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CFL 110 here on the Winnipeg Sports Talk YouTube channel and podcast network. Brought to you by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg. Andrew Paterson, Jeff Hamilton, with our weekly trip around another very interesting week in the Canadian Football League. And of course, it's all brought to you by our great sponsors at Garage Living Winnipeg. Is your garage a mess? Do you have a tough time opening your car door because of all the clutter? Well, Garage Living Winnipeg can help. In just a few days, you can have a beautiful, clean, functional garage that looks amazing and adds value to your home. They specialize in stunning polyaspartic floor coatings, high-end made-in-Canada metal cabinets, slat wall, and overhead storage solutions. And of course, our pal Pat Kanuga can join you at your place for a free in-garage consultation at 204-999-1234. I actually bumped into Pat at the Goldeye game last week, and he had mentioned that he just came back from a trip to the Okanagan where he visited the distributor Performance Hoist to check out the operation and see all of their products. Garage Living Winnipeg can also be set up with a single or a double hoist, so you can work on cars throughout the winter and just add a whole new dimension to your garage. For all you sled heads out there, how great would it be to have a hoist to work on your machine instead of crawling around on the floor this winter? Give Pat a call if you need a lift or more at 204-999-1234 or visit their website at garageliving.com where you can see everything else they do for an extreme garage makeover or a minor garage makeover, flooring, cabinets, and other storage solutions. Again, 999-1234, our pal Pat Kanuga and Garage Living Winnipeg. Garages made for living. All right, another wild week in the CFL that started with a bang here in Winnipeg on Thursday. But before we get to all of that, the Hammer joins us now, living it up on the road. What's going on? Great to catch up with you again after a busy few days for both of us.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Yeah, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers blessed us last week with a Thursday game ahead of the August long weekend, so took full advantage of that. We'll get to the game in a bit. Headed out to Ottawa, actually, specifically Shafie's Lock. It's the family cabin. It's been taken over by my aunt and uncle in recent years, but it's been with the family for decades. We have a family reunion every Sunday, so if you can imagine that many Hamiltons in one room, it was hard to get a word in edgewise, but overall it was solid, and I extended that into a trip out to Ottawa, where I am now, and then to wrap things up in Montreal. If you've ever been to Montreal, no better way to wrap things up than do a trip out there. How about you, man? You were catching big fish, weren't you, over the weekend? Looked like you were having just as much fun.
Reporter of Winnipeg Sports Talk, and honestly, the highlight of the summer every year. And listen, it couldn't have been any better. I mean, I, like many people, don't get a chance to take many days off. We had to travel out there, so. But Michael and Connor took over for the show on Friday, and I'll be honest, was heading out of town as they were doing the show, and I'm like, oh, I'd love to be on today to talk about the game. But I knew we'd have the opportunity to do that this week on CFL 110. And let's get to Thursday, because it was, like, despite the record, if you had just shown up knowing what the Blue Bombers had been for the last number of seasons, and you weren't aware of the first 8 games of the year, and you rolled up to the stadium and saw nearly 32,000 people having a hell of a time packing that stadium, and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers coming out and doing what they did, you would have thought that this team just picked up where they left off the last number of seasons. That was so far from the case, Jeff, and it wasn't even 1 week ago, coming off that very concerning loss to Toronto, that there were plenty of questions as to whether this team was even a playoff team. Well, they answered that question with maybe the biggest statement game I can remember from this team in a long, long time. Man, did they need it. But it's one thing to get a win. It's another thing to win the way they did against the number one offense in football, holding them to absurd numbers, 4 first downs, time of possession that was 42-18 in the Bombers' favor. Vernon Adams having the worst game of his professional career and a shutout of the number one offensive team in the league. Even 5 days removed, it's still hard to wrap your head around what happened between Winnipeg and BC last Thursday night.
Huss, it's almost like, need I add more? I mean, as you mentioned, it was only a week before that we were kind of talking about the Bombers' obituary. Now, obviously, prefacing that with saying that this is the Canadian Football League, and if, as I often say on this show and my weekly hit on Mondays, if you don't like the narrative around your team, go out and change it. Well, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers did that. Had they won that game, just say a nail-biting win, a lot of people would have been surprised. We've heard a hell of a lot about short weeks, particularly out of Montreal, out of Edmonton, and how nasty those have been to teams. Well, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers didn't seem to have an issue with the short week, and they played a team that I'll add was coming off the bye week. A fresh BC Lions team, and so there's certainly life in this club now, and they've this victory, while 3-6 is nothing to brag about, and certainly the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are not bragging at 3-6. They're back in the West right now. And, and we'll get to, why that is, particularly on the quarterback situations in BC and Saskatchewan. But this is a team that went out and looked like the 2021 Bombers when the average margin of victory was upwards of 2 touchdowns. And so, this is a club that, you mentioned all those things, the time of possession, the effort by the defense, man. I mean, that wasn't surprising because the defense has been the bread and butter of this team all season long. That was maybe surprising early on, but now that we're midway through the season, that's been the bread and butter. That will remain the bread and butter of this team, this defense for Winnipeg. To finally get the pressure that they got. I mean, they already have arguably the best secondary in the CFL. I mean, you look at Evan Holm and Dietrich Nichols as halfbacks. It doesn't get much better than that in this league. You look at a guy like Terrell Bonds, who's come on and been a boundary corner, who's working alongside Dietrich Nichols, who he was playing alongside when they were in high school together. So the chemistry was already built in when they showed up. In Tyrell Ford, what more can you say about Tyrell Ford? I know a lot of conversation, a lot of chatter around this league is centered around his twin brother Trey, and rightfully so. But Tyrell Ford has also been living up to the hype. He spent last year with for a small stint, mind you, with the Green Bay Packers, tried to live out that NFL dream. He's making magic happen. But Huss, that defensive effort, man, 4 first downs. 4 first downs. That's one shy of the CFL record. And we're talking about a long time ago. We're talking about four first downs tied a Bombers franchise record. And those 3 first downs were allowed both by the BC Lions, ironically, in the 50s and the 70s, I believe. So it was back in an era where it's just a different era. Now with all the rules that are made to benefit the offense, every single rule is made to benefit the offense and to give fans the game that they've come to love in the CFL, which is just offensive forward. So to have all that done, man, I mean, this to me, we talked about it. If you could get another victory, if you could pile on some victories, you're talking about second in the West. I think second in the West is now very possible for Winnipeg. But I'll end it with this, Huss. It means absolutely nothing. And this is the words coming out of Mike O'Shea's mouth post-game when I asked him what could a win like this do to, rally the troops or to, save a season. Words he would never say, mind you, but asked him that question nonetheless. And he said it will mean absolutely nothing if they don't take care of themselves over this bye week coming up here, because they got to welcome the BC Lions right back. And we know the Lions are not going to be happy. They're banged up right now, but they're not going to be happy about their performance after a dominating win by the Blue and Gold.
Well, you'll recall last week when we spoke, and I said, listen, let's not count the Bombers out too quickly. I mean, there's been a lot of games that could have gone either way, but I kind of leaned on the performance of the defense. I mean, the previous 2 losses, they give up less than 20 on the road in Regina and lose, and then the defense gave up 6 points and somehow managed to lose that game, which, to be honest, seemed, almost impossible. So the defense had been giving them the opportunity to win. I thought that, though, against BC, a team that put up 500 on them earlier this year, this was going to need to be a game that the offense would really break out, and you'd have to put up sort of 35, 40 points if you were going to win. How wrong we were, because the defense saved its best for last week, and they were even better. They were even more dominant. And, much for the same reason I said Saskatchewan, even without Trevor Harris, we have to start talking about them as a Grey Cup contender because they've got a championship level defense. This Bomber defense right now is doing the job to keep them in any football game. And if the offense can get going, this team is going to be a very, very tough out. From the offensive side of the ball, they did move it well. They still would like to get more 6s than 3s, but you knew Sergio Castillo would bounce back. Another 60-yarder, but a really balanced attack, moving the chains, keeping the football out of Vernon Adams' hands. And I mean, they went 2 and out every time they got the football. It was just a stunning result, but a huge one for a Bomber team that I think a lot of people knew had the potential to play like that. We just hadn't seen it for a full 60 minutes yet this season.
I think we're missing one thing to wrap up the whole Bombers thing, because I know we're putting, because it is a big victory for them. There's no doubt about it. But the play, to just, take what you were saying, Haas, the offense, the O-line. They were able to move the ball, right? Brady Oliveira probably got the quietest 100 rushing yard game you've ever seen.
Yeah.
You had Zach Clares had time to throw the ball. I mean, you're right. I think if there was a knock on anything, this was arguably the most complimentary football we've certainly seen from Winnipeg this year. If the offense would do one more thing, it would put the ball in the end zone a bit more. You don't want to be kicking 6 field goals, but if you are going to be kicking 6 field goals, as you mentioned, a second 60-yarder this season, who better to call out than a Sergio Castillo? Most teams in this league, I'd argue more than half, aren't even calling their guy out, for a 56, 57-yard attempt.
And that's not an O'Shea. O'Shea hasn't normally done that. I mean, he just figured that there's not
a conversation happens before the
guy.
game. Sergio Castillo goes over to him. He says, "This is my limit." You hit it the first time when you're desperate for one. Mind you, that was in a losing effort to Calgary, but it was a tough game for both sides to get points. To be able to rely on your guy, be on your side of the field, is a pretty, or at least close to your side of the field, close to midfield. That's about as good as it gets for your kicker. And Sergio Castillo, we talk a lot about in these parts about Justin Medlock and what he did for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in his time here. Sergio Castillo is creeping up there, and he's, like Medlock, even more so than Medlock. No offense to him, because he's a great dude, quiet for sure, will give you give the time of day to anybody. So very great in that. Sergio Castillo is also like an ultimate leader. Now, Medlock was a leader too, so I don't want to twist things up saying Castillo was a leader and Medlock wasn't, but Castillo brings this real kind of friendly energy, brings something real to a Bombers team that has lost, that kind of personality with Rasheed Bailey gone, with Jamarcus Hardrick gone, with some of those bigger personalities on the team. Sergio Castillo has been, filling in the gap nicely this year while also kicking the hell out of the ball.
Well, and listen, I mean, he that's the way you want players to respond after their worst game of the season. I mean, he had a big hand in that loss to the Toronto Argonauts and had a massive hand in the shutout win over the British Columbia Lions. By the way, I got to thank a bunch of people popped by and, said some nice things about WST, but in particular CFL 110 at the game. And I'm just looking in our YouTube chat right here. Jonathan Rempel, Hustler, I came up to you at the Bomber game near the Rum Hut gate and said how much I enjoyed the CFL show. Love the content. Jonathan, it was very nice of you to say that. It was great bumping into you, and appreciate you and everyone that's joining us here. And again, if you've got some other big Bomber fans or fans of the local team in your market that want more CFL content, let them know how to find it. Search CFL 110 on your favorite podcast feeds. And, of course, just give us a sub on the YouTube channel for Winnipeg Sports Talk, and we'll have the fresh episode every Wednesday here on WST. Well, listen, the talk of the league on Friday certainly was what happened with Winnipeg and BC. There were some other big games on the weekend, and one of those involved Trey Ford finally getting the start for the Edmonton Elks, and what do you know? They got a win. They put up 42 on the Riders in Regina. This is a huge step in, I guess, silencing the critics that he's had. He's got a lot of people pulling for him. But, man, you put up 42, and bottom line, just get a win for a team that had found more ways to lose. A dynamic play. Listen, the passing numbers weren't huge. They did have that one, 80-yarder or something like that.
93 bullets.
So that's basically half of his passing yardage in the entire game. But what was interesting to me upon further review, Jeff, is what Trey Ford's just simple presence in that offense does to open up the running game, not necessarily for Trey Ford. I mean, Leak had 2 touchdown runs of over 50 yards on a Rider defense that had been very stingy so far this season. How significant is this win for the Elks? Both for Trey Ford, but also in the scope of a season right now that still has more than half the games remaining.
Okay, as bananas as this sounds, and it's going to sound bananas, not to the hardcore CFL fans, but in general. Now, the playoff lives are not strong. Okay, at 1-7, no one's talking about how, you're going to be climbing the standings, but they're not dead. And that alone in and of itself is a huge thing for the Elks. And I mean, the biggest takeaway, Huss, here is simple, man. And I'm guilty of it too. And Chris Jones decided to bring in McLeod Bethel-Thompson. I thought it was the right move. I thought it was the move that would bring some, just for now, right? Especially when you put yourself in Chris Jones' spot, right? I mean, that's a big season for him. Trey Ford is a young, somewhat immature, lots of growing to go, obviously athletically gifted, probably the best athlete on the Edmonton Elks, on maybe even the entire CFL. But it made sense to kind of go with the veteran pivot in what was a critical year. You had pieces around him. You wanted to bring a guy who brought some consistency to the game. What you saw from Trey Ford in previous years was super sexy. He was the guy who was making plays happen. It was like, wow, this guy's a highlight reel machine. But as a coach, you don't know if you're going to get that week in and week out. Well, I know it's just one game, man, but holy smokes. You just have to think what the Elks season would look like right now had they just gone to what, was working at points last season. The only thing that was working at points last season, and that's Trey Ford. The Riders went out. They said, Trey Ford, we are going to force you to beat us with your arm. We know how dangerous you are with your legs. And while I thought Trey Ford certainly did some running around early on in the game, got a couple key first downs, I saw a guy who was up for the challenge and, opened up massive opportunity for Javon Leake. This guy's presence alone, it was very, very, very clear that Corey Mace and the Saskatchewan Roughriders were daring Trey Ford to beat them in any other way that he's done in the past. And that's always been with his legs. He's been able to, score passing touchdowns and whatnot, but they've always been a byproduct of his legs. And while his legs were certainly, active in that game, it was just his presence and his ability to, I thought he was a crisp passer. He didn't have a ton of yards, but he had over 200. Yes, 93 of those were in that touchdown, which I thought was Tevin Jones. I thought that was a great, obviously busted coverage, a great pass for Trey Ford. And I think he proved it. I think he proved that he can be that everyday quarterback. I think that there were critics like myself, and I'm not certainly adding myself to the top of the critic list. I'm not beating myself up too much. I didn't think Trey Ford wasn't, quality quarterback. I just think he needed some seasoning. Clearly he was ready for it. He was ready for this game. He was ready when he came in the fourth quarter against Hamilton the week, before that. And this is a guy that he just has to get, the reins the rest of the way. And what's amazing about this, man, is like, what happens now with Trey Ford? Like, this guy is on an expiring contract. He's playing for an OC and a interim head coach and Jarius Jackson, who didn't want him involved. It wasn't like Chris Jones was running down the hallway, after week 3 and 4 saying, don't you dare touch McLeod Bethel-Thompson, even though, of course, you can make the argument that MBT wasn't really the issue. However, you had a guy sitting there. He had shown glimpses. That offensive coordinator in Jackson didn't want him out there. You have a GM in G. Roy Simon who was as involved as Chris Jones in making the decisions on the roster, was part of that decision-making and bringing in McLeod Bethel-Thompson. If it wasn't clear earlier in the season, it feels very clear now. I don't know how those guys salvage their jobs for next season. Equally don't get how they don't move on the rest of the year with Trey Ford behind center. And it's just a fascinating situation. We'll see how it plays out. But wow, man, I was super impressed with him, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of Trey Ford. I'm now on the Trey Ford train, if you will.
You're going to see it. You're going to see it more on the weekend. They're actually, and we'll get to the lines at the end, but a 1.5 point home favorite over BC, of course, without Vernon Adams and Jake Dolegala starting. Listen, it's just great that they got a result. I mean, I know they're in in a tight West division, and the bottom line is the CFL needs this team to be back to being relevant. And if this young man can come in, help them win some football games, get some excitement back into the future of the team, it's great for the league overall. New ownership, which is coming apparently. And I would assume that everyone's going to be blown out at the end of the season. But if this guy can establish himself as the guy moving forward, it's a big thing. They've been trying to do that for the last 3 years, and it hasn't happened. Maybe finally now they'll have their quarterback moving forward. You mentioned the West, and the Elks are at the bottom. The Bombers had their big win. Calgary has been, just kind of 500, win your home games, lose your road games. But all of a sudden, things are tightening up a little bit in that BC and Saskatchewan have both lost their last 2 games. Both will be without their starting quarterbacks this week. I guess the combo question, is the West wide open right now? And where is the concern higher right now? BC after what the Bombers did to them last week and losing VA, or the Riders who, lost a very winnable game with a 13-point lead the week before in Montreal and then came back and, got lit up pretty good by the Edmonton Elks who hadn't beaten anyone.
It's a great question. Why it's so interesting now that if you're the Edmonton Elks, or particularly if you're the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, we'll get to the Stamps in a bit. We'll figure out what exactly, who they are. But you look at 2 teams that it wasn't long ago we were talking about the class of the West, class of the league, and and what's the number one thing that can derail your season? Losing your number one quarterback. And with Vernon Adams, it's very obvious. If it wasn't obvious, even though Vernon Adams did have arguably his worst game as a professional against Winnipeg, Jake Dolegala did absolutely nothing in behind in his 1 quarter of play. In fact, it looked like Rick Campbell didn't even want him to throw the ball. He had 3 passing attempts, and when they got the ball back late in the game, they were able to get a first down and ultimately run out the last 90 seconds of the clock. Jake Dolegala didn't look like a guy with killer instinct that wanted to come in and help his team get back in the game. He was getting for a guy who's 6'7", 6'8", he's one of the tallest guys in the league, to have passes being deflected. Mind you, I think both, if not at least one, was from Willie Jefferson, who's also one of the longest DNs. So credit to Willie J in that respect. But there's nothing about the BC Lions outside of Vernon Adams that is all that scary. There's Chase Bryce. It might even be Bryce Chase. I've just found that out earlier today, Huss, on who this guy is. He was signed in 2023, has exactly 0 pass attempts. He was able to be a backup quarterback, twice last season. Might as well have been an extra in a CFL movie because he didn't touch the field. And now you look at Jake Dolegala. I think right now the BC Lions defense was never that good. And the thing about the Lions, and particularly with Vernon Adams, is his ability, much like Zach Collaros when he's at the top of his game, some of the best ability they have is escape ability. And, Vernon Adams makes his escape ability, if you will, his ability to break the pocket. And if he's not, running with the ball, being able to find open receivers, downfield, he's making up for what is a pretty below average offensive line in BC. And, we saw that we saw the Bombers get a lot of pressure with 3, not 4. They were struggling getting pressure with 4 all season long. To be able to get to the quarterback the way they did with 3 is a scary situation and a massive red flag for the BC Lions. We're hearing out of reports. It's week to week. It's not it's not month to month, Rick Campbell said after the game, and those reports have fallen in the days afterwards. And I think that, even the idea of him coming back in August, so that's good news if you're the BC Lions, and maybe the answers change because Trevor Harris was held out, I think is held out again this week for precautionary reasons. I think, or was it obviously missed last week. That was a mess up. Obviously, the Elks are a bad team, but something had to give, and they got Trey Forded. So at this point, can you give a freebie to either one of those teams? I don't know, because now in my head, I'm almost changing my mind mid answer here, Huss, because it's 2 losses in a row for both of these clubs. It's 3 in the last 4 for Saskatchewan, and while Shea Paterson was able to eclipse the 300 passing yards this past weekend, it was for nothing. And so you look at a group and what Edmonton was able to do was it a great game by Edmonton or a bad game by Sask? A bit of both. We'll see. But, for a team that was getting eaten alive in the passing game, bending, not breaking on defense, and was really making their hay in the rushing game, allowing something like under 4 yards per carry to have the Elks then post almost 10 yards. It was like 9.9, I believe, average in rushing yards. So both teams do not look good. Both teams look beatable. And both teams are dealing with, the number one issue, that GMs pray at the beginning of the season they don't have to deal with, and that's injuries to their number one quarterback. So right now looks bad for both clubs.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give the nod actually to the Riders. I mean, despite last week, I'll give them a mulligan on that game. I think their defense is good enough that they're going to be a tough out come playoff time, and whether they're playing at home or on the road, you're going to have to earn your points. For BC, I'll sort of echo that. Their defense is just, it's pretty good, I guess. I mean, it's not the worst, but that's a team that beats you with all of that offensive firepower. And totally. Listen, if VA is not in or is not at 100% or plays like he did against Winnipeg, they're going to have a very tough time winning football games. Bottom line is the West, very much wide open. You talk about teams that have lost their starting quarterback. There's another team that's done that in the Montreal Alouettes and hasn't missed a beat. We talked last week about Alexander's incredible debut coming in the second half and rallying the team past the Riders from a 13-point deficit. Maybe it wasn't as spectacular last week against Hamilton, but the Montreal Alouette defense told them, don't worry about it. We got this. I got burned. I really thought Hamilton would give a much better performance last week. They were dreadful against that Montreal D. And now they're 7-1. No need to rush Cody Fajardo back. Good times for the defending Grey Cup champs right now, who sit atop all of the CFL power polls.
You know what, man? If you have a dangerous D like the Montreal Alouettes have, much like we saw and how, Winnipeg had a dangerous everything, but when you have defense and much like the BC Lions, when you have an offense that can keep the ball on, your defense is going to get better. When you have the defense that the Montreal Alouettes have, not only is it messy for, your opponent, it's certainly better for your offense and getting lots of opportunity. And so, you look at the Alouettes and I just get the same vibes, if you will, that I got with the 2019 Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Belief is a dangerous thing. And when you feel like you've been counted out and you feel like, people don't give you the respect you feel you deserve, and yet you're atop the league standings, much like the attitude the Winnipeg Blue Bombers had. If they ever showed any kind of emotion ever, or if you'd heard any kind of quiet rumblings, if this team was pissed off, it was because, people were talking about Vernon Adams and the BC Lions, and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers were first. So it's, you want that respect. You demand that respect when you're atop of the standings, and that's what I see with the Montreal Alouettes. And of course, none of that even matters if you don't have good coaching. And Jason Moss has surrounded himself, it's been well documented the changes he's made as a human being on the sideline and how he's, contained his emotions and, his message with this organization in particular, and how proud they are of their heritage and their French Canadian roots and embracing all those things. Like, these are things that you put in place to build a strong culture, and that allows people, even when you do get a little bit more turnover, as was the case with Montreal, as maybe compared to Winnipeg in previous years, you still have the right leadership group in place to kind of show the rest of that group. And we go into games, whether you're missing your number one quarterback or whether you're missing a key guy on defense or whoever's out of the lineup any given week, you go in there with the confidence that the person that's going to come in is going to embrace that culture, is going to grasp that. And I see that with the Alouettes through and through. And, as soon as Cody Fajardo gets back in there and with this group, they're going to be a dangerous team. With as battered as the West is, I think, this is going to be I think you're going to see even better football from the Montreal Alouettes. I think it's going to be demanded by Jason Moss, who has a lot of different similar characteristics in him as Mike O'Shea. Obviously, they have a long history together, but it's a little bit of a disappointing stuff with Montreal. Was Caleb Evans came in late in that game and suffered what appears to be a season-ending knee injury. They picked up Dom Davis. So the Lions can't even pick up their old friend, buddy Dom Davis, an old Winnipeg Blue Bomber who's just been carving out a generational career as a short yardage / backup option. So good for Dom. But yeah, this is a team I think is going to continue to make hay, and it all starts with coaching and leadership with that group.
It would be a lot more concerning if Alexander hadn't proven that he could do the job with Cody Fajardo. Not that Evans was tearing it up. There was a reason why Alexander got in there in the first place. And listen, Dom Davis, do you want him throwing the football? Hell no. Are you confident with him on 3rd and 1? Absolutely. Nice ad for Montreal. They are the team to beat right now. They were already the champs coming in. They reminded everybody of that in week 1 right here in the Peg against Winnipeg in game 1 of the CFL season. And now seem to be clearly the number 1 team in the league right now. Two wins clear of both Saskatchewan and BC right now at 7 and 1. The Stamps might be the most perplexing club in the Canadian Football League. They have been, they big comeback win. First off, they look great late. They didn't look very good through 3 quarters. But this team is now 4-0 at home, 0-4 on the road. And there's been some dreadful road games. They got absolutely smacked around by Ottawa a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question is, who are the Calgary Stampeders and what to make of them going forward? My take on them is that they are just sort of a mid team. Good enough to be in games, probably not good enough to beat the best teams in the league, good enough to beat the teams that they should when they're at home. But man, the home road split, they've looked like a completely different team away from McMahon Stadium so far this year. And listen, 500 will get you to the playoffs, but it won't get you much more in the CFL. And that's sort of what the Stamps are right now, despite a a win that maybe could be a turning point for them to take this to the next level and not be win one, lose one for the rest of the season.
Pretty much took the words out of my mouth. I think as you often hear in professional sports, you are what your record says. At 4-4, I feel like the Calgary Stampeders are exactly that. They're some good with some bad, and it's tough. And even that game against the Argos felt like a microcosm of their season, where they look kind of like dead now. No one seems like they're involved and wants to win. And you have a Toronto team that's trucking its way to a victory. And you have Dave Dickinson at halftime pretty much saying who wants to play on this team next year? Like, who wants to play on this team next week? You guys, who wants to show that they give a shit? And that's got to be one of the most frustrating things from a coach is you just want consistency. You obviously want victories. You definitely want victories. That's what keeps you in. That's what makes keeps your job. That's what gets you all the accolades that we've seen Dave Dickinson get, and that's what keeps you in the league for as long as he has been. But he has just been chasing consistency now for years with this organization. And, you look at last season, how young they were. You look at the play of Jake Mayer and how he lost it. I was in Calgary a few weeks ago. I can tell you right now, this guy had a workout regimen that was much different than the previous year. He shed significant weight. He looks like that quarterback who we saw, a couple of years ago that was brewing before, and now, to take over for Bo Levi. And again, we haven't seen that consistency either, but this Stamps team is just, they can, and when, for the odds makers, man, I don't know how you make the odds here, because you don't know if Calgary is going to come out and kick some team's ass, or if they're just going to absolutely get their asses beat. But as you mentioned, man, it's just something about McMahon. Maybe it's the crappy facilities for the other teams. Something about being the home cooking with the Stamps, because they can't beat anybody on the road. And they're throwing a real wrench into some plans for some teams in the West. They're hovering around. That's what I love about it, is that maybe they find their groove. And you hear this thing about, the real season starts after Labor Day. Well, maybe that's exactly what the Stampeders are trying to do, is figure out who they are, figure out their identity. And if they can tread water, much like they're doing now, they'll find themselves in prime position to climb up the West standings, given for all the reasons we've already talked about. So as bad as things have gone, it's actually a vast, not even bad. It's been bad and good. It's a vast improvement from last season, where they were 6-12. They're already 2 wins away from matching last season's total, where they squeezed into the playoffs. So it is better times for them, but certainly there's been, my biggest takeaway is, having been in Calgary for a handful of games, just having, hearing Dave Dickinson talk after other games, he just seems like he's trying to reel this team in. Like, he's got a bunch of kids. sprinkled in a handful of veterans and some talent, but he's just got to reel these guys in and get them playing consistent football week to week. And then we'll see some of the Stampeders teams of old.
Yeah, until further notice, I will be fading them on the road and betting them at home. And it's interesting, a battle of 2 4-4 teams that just had that wild one last week, back at it this weekend at BMO when the Stamps meet the Toronto Argonauts. Just on principle, I'll be taking the Argos in that one, although they haven't looked particularly great. They both are just sort of very middle-of-the-road teams right now. But it'll be interesting to see how they fare in a rematch right after the game in Calgary, knowing what the trends have been with Calgary at home and on the road. Speaking of the Argos, we are coming up on 9 games for Chad Kelly, who's still out while he serves his suspension for violating the league's gender-based violence policy. Now, if we recall, he was out at least 9 games. There was a number of things that he needed to do to be able to return. I said I was dubious or somewhat doubtful that he would be able to do all those things. But listen, obviously you want people to do the right thing and to make it back. What are we hearing about Chad Kelly? When do we expect him, if at all, to be back with the Argos? And then from a football perspective, outside of the CFL perspective of the optics and everything else that's happened, how important is that going to be for the Argos if they want to be challenging the Alouettes in the East?
All good questions. Well, the first one, so the suspension wasn't a 9-game suspension. The suspension was 9 games, and then he'll be reassessed. Now, could he be brought back into the fold? Could he play game 10? Effectively, yeah. Unless we hear otherwise, that's the evaluation process. And anyone who's unfamiliar kind of with the not just the league's gender-based violence policy, but how it's executed. I actually wrote a somewhat detailed investigation on this years ago when Johnny Manziel came in. It's called Flags on the Play. Just Google Flags on the Play, Johnny Manziel will come up for you. And it's a pretty, in this story, I go through the whole process. I go through the process of, vetting players who are coming in, players who have checkered past, players that get, get in trouble while they're in the league. And just to be clear, the gender-based violence policy, it does take a rehabilitative approach to things. And this is built on, from violence, violence against women experts, gender-based violence experts in general across the country believe that it's not, what you shouldn't be doing is cutting a guy loose immediately, right? So you're not supposed to be, so a guy, goes through an incident, say similar to what Chad Kelly went through or some of the other ones we've had in the CFL in the past. You're not supposed to just cut the guy off because you're not supposed to just take his income right away. You're not supposed to just, cut him loose so he goes into a different community, angry, upset, and maybe has a higher likelihood of doing the same thing again. So what they do is they analyze you, they watch you, they take into consideration what you've been posting on social media, they any kind of social channels, and we've seen Chad Kelly kind of go off on social media
they
since
changed
he's
his
lost the
password.
suspension.
Somebody changed his
they must
password
have,
for him.
he had some comments for when Cameron Dukes wasn't playing well. He had some videos early on and around the draft, and those things are all supposed to be taken into consideration along with the other key factors, including admitting what you did was wrong. And not just, it's not just one of those set in front of the parole board with a smile and say, no, I learned my lesson. You really need to convince these people that you've learned your lesson, that what you did was wrong, and that you're ready to move forward a better person, and obviously worthy of this second shot, if you will, or return to professional football. So all that process is ongoing right now, and it will be, I imagine there's, if you're the Toronto Argonauts or if you're the CFL, if you're Chad Kelly, that deadline is coming up here. You've had some classes, you've done some, some counseling and whatnot, and maybe it is a final session. Thanks, Chad. We've really seen you grow. Good luck. I hope we don't see you again, kind of thing. Or maybe there's more evaluation or more needed to clear him, if you will. Maybe it's another game or so. Maybe it's another week. So we don't really know any of that. It's all super secretive. It's all hush hush. I do get out a lot of the details, if not all of them. None of them are specific case based, but they do talk about the things that they look for in the process in which they undergo to get a player back or to welcome a player into the league. So again, it is extensive. We'll see if Chad Kelly can, for lack of a better term, pass that or show that he's changed and learned from his behavior. But that's the first step. And then ultimately, if he does, it's getting him back up to speed with the offense, with the team. And what I found interesting, was hearing Ryan Dinwiddie talk in recent weeks about how he'd like the CFL to allow Chad Kelly to practice with the team, to be around the club, to get ready for, ultimately game 10. So he's not, practicing that week and he hasn't practiced for months, right? He's been working out in a separate building, doing his thing.
I wonder if that might not happen after week 9 before he is officially reinstated. Like, there might be a little bit of a middle room.
There's no rule.
Chad Kelly that'll be up to the commissioner, I guess, right?
No, it's not. There's no rule. Chad Kelly could practice today. Chad Kelly could have practiced the first week.
Well, yeah,
that's
right. Because
the Argos decided, which is their, which kudos to them, especially in this situation. But at least take the first while off. But any resistance or any issue with Chad Kelly getting back up to speed, safe for game 10, is all in Toronto's hands.
So is that just a public plea to Pinball to say, hey, can we loosen this up a bit?
I don't, from the sounds of it, Huss, I don't think it was a public plea. It sounded like a head coach who had no idea who calls the shots for who practices in these situations. But the league has absolutely no say in all. They have a say in when Chad Kelly comes back, puts an Argo jersey on, and is behind center. But they don't have, it's in the collective bargaining agreement. Chad Kelly could practice every single day from the moment he was suspended until this, till today.
This is all PR and optics, right? Because of how poorly they were perceived to have handled it right off the bat.
Of course, and I think they make the right choice.
If Ryan Dinwiddie is saying, "Hey, we need to get this guy in practice and ready to go," then there's no rule against it, and he's not banned by the CFL. That's either Pinball or maybe someone up in MLSC that just doesn't want to do that. But other than that, he should just tell Chad Kelly, show up tomorrow and get practicing. And by the way, have you done all your counseling and all the other things we need you to do before you go to the parole board, as you said, and try and get clear? One thing I'll say is that this is not, some depth D tackle on any team in the league. This is a guy that was the MOP last year. He's the quarterback in the biggest market.
What do they say in this league, though, Hutch? What do they say in this league? You're only as good as your last game. What was Chad Kelly's last game?
His last game was a disaster, an absolute disaster. He did sign a big contract, though, and I just think that this is going to be looked at and scrutinized far more than probably many other previous cases with the CFL policy and situations before it. And certainly with the way the Argos have been so far this season, just from a football standpoint for a minute, other than the PR and the optics and all that, I think it's quite clear that they would like to get Chad Kelly in. And, this next week or so, I would imagine that we'll get some clarity as to where those steps are at right now and how realistic a pending return of Chad Kelly is going to be. Hey, before we finish up, and this is not the first time we've discussed this, and listen, there's going to be calls that don't go your way, and very rarely will we spend a lot of time talking about officiating. But this is a little different. There is chaos in the command center right now. And Jeff, we are seeing plays that are being challenged that to the average guy sitting at home watching the CFL on TSN thinking is a slam dunk obvious decision that are not being called that way. And it's puzzling, and it has happened in a number of games this year. But the fumble by James Tuck last week, and if you looked, Herb Zurkowski's hilarious. Herb was at his crusty best on Twitter right now.
Yeah, at that moment,
calling it a garage league and whatnot. But how are they not getting this right? It's one thing. I give a lot of benefit of the doubt to the referees who are calling things in real time on the field. But for crying out loud, you've got all these cameras, you've got video replay. How hard is it to get it right?
problem is they're getting in their own way, and that's the issue here. I mean, we saw it weeks earlier when Mike O'Shea decided to make a point by challenging a play that, in much like this situation, had been blown down way too early by the official. In that case, it was an incomplete pass. In this case, it was essentially blown dead, right? And then when they went to go check it out, like, it wasn't deemed a fumble because Wesley Sutton didn't secure it right away. It has to be, if the play gets blown dead too early, then you can't essentially hesitate in the scoop up of the loose ball, which has been decided as the rule to determine whether or not that the whistle played a role or not. Like, if for some reason in a split second that Hamilton, none of whom were even around the ball, was somehow going to squeak out and grab it, but because the play was called down premature, they had to go to that rule, which just completely eliminates common sense. Because if you look at Wesley Sutton, yeah, he juggles the ball a little bit as it's this live pro football play, but it's about a second and a half after the fumble happens that he scoops it up. Like, how much quicker are you expecting this guy
and no one else
to
was
pick up
getting
the
it.
ball? And nobody else was getting it. And so, you have that. Like, it's just that. Isn't that why you have replay? Like, isn't the replay to fix things? Like, why are the refs trying to get it right off the, and I guess you're supposed to call it the way you see it. Well, if you're seeing it that way, you shouldn't be calling games. So, if anything, there should be a reluctance to blow the whistle. And then in that case, you would have had that extra time. And if it was what you thought it was, if it wasn't a fumble by Jane Stuck, then you get to go to the command center anyways. Because it's a turnover. If in that case, it could be the command center could jump in, and that's the big thing. A lot of people don't know when the command center is supposed to come in and do things. Obviously, every touchdown and every turnover. But in this case, wasn't deemed a turnover, and so they had to go through the challenge. I mean, you look at it and you're just like, you're kind of grabbing your hair there, not as a, especially if you're an Alouettes fan, but if you're just a fan of football, you're just pulling your hair out because what you're watching is a typical play just get botched in real time. And, what the feeling I just get left with these, and, I was going to preface it by saying I hate talking about the officials. Well, the officials drive me nuts probably 2 or 3 times a game, no matter what game I'm watching. So, I get it. It's not my fault that these guys are part-time workers. You know what I mean? Like, it's not the fans' fault. This is a professional league. The CFL likes to talk about how, professional it is and all these things. Well, then maybe commit something to it, because in this situation, it didn't end up affecting the game result, right? Hamilton got the ball back. I don't know what they did with that drive. Maybe turned it over for the way they were playing, but that play just doesn't need, that play, if that's in a Grey Cup game, if that's in a playoff game, if that's in a game that's late in the regular season that's deciding playoff, league standings and therefore playoff matchups, and you have to go the letter of the law that isn't a fumble, man, this is going to be ripped on a lot more than CFL 110, other podcasts out there, anybody else who opines about the league, whatever. It's going to go way deeper. Teams are going to get, way angrier when the stakes are much higher. So when you couple some of these plays with, the clear issue the league has right now in defining what exactly defensive pass interference is and isn't, it's just become, it's created these moments in games that just feel so preventable that if that is the rule that's in play, maybe it needs to be changed. Maybe it needs to be revisited. We've seen things in the past where when, I hate bringing it up when I don't remember what it is, but Jeffrey Orridge had the power and changed a rule like overnight one time. And, so they have the ability. They don't have to wait till the off season to sit down and go through the rules committee and propose it and whatever. If it's creating what it created yesterday and that gets replicated, and the luck of this league, Huss, it's going to happen again. Sometimes, some plays much more important, and it's going to be a much bigger issue, and it's going to create a much bigger problem. So if they can just figure this thing out better.
Yeah, you could probably tweak it just with a little changing of the wording of the rule,
Totally.
which I think gives more leeway to things like common sense. And I'll be honest, I've said this before. I mean, I'm a proponent of more video replay, especially in football, in the Canadian Football League, with the challenges of the officials. I'd love to have a ref just in the booth every game. That's part of the team that can just radio down. Like, I think at times we put too much pressure on the coaches for their valuable challenges. If a mistake's made, a way to quickly assess and address that while keeping the game moving, I think would be great. But again, it all comes down to the ability to get it right when you are reviewing it. And I mean, in this particular situation, it is the way the rule is worded. But I think there's the potential to make the game work a lot better. And at the end of the day, get the most calls right, which of course has to be the goal of every officiating group in any game that's played.
Huss, I need to add one thing to it, and it's this. It's how great would it be for TSN to bring in a rules broadcaster?
Yes.
Just bring in a rules broadcaster, somebody on the broadcast who knows the rules. And I'm not, I love, TSN does a great job. They certainly have kept this league alive financially. They care about this league. I know a lot of people wish they cared more. Trust me, the people inside those buildings care about the CFL. But it would be great to have somebody there to throw to who knows the book inside and out. Sometimes commentators know, because it's confusing in some cases. I'll admit it. I don't know every single rule. Now, I'm not up in the booth expected to tell thousands of people in real time exactly what it is. There should be a producer in here, and a lot of times there is. But there are some of these quirky things. At the very least, if you had somebody there who knew the rule book, you could bring them on, and man, could it be great television.
Oh, listen,
you know what I mean? Like, it would be, you'd have these people being like, this is a slam dunk, or you'll have somebody who goes, whoa, guys, get this. This is like, this is the wrench in the play. This is, the ball, the play had been deemed dead. And if you go to the letter of the law, because a lot of times you're sitting there, and I think the frustration is because you're kind of sitting there waiting for more information or clarity on something, and when you don't get it, and you're just sitting there confused, you kind of just go, what the hell was that game all about? And that reminds me of another thing, Huss, and got to get to the bottom of this, because I had heard some rumblings after this wild Toronto game, right, where the Bombers just fumbled their way to defeat, and there were a lot of things that weren't working for them. But Toronto called a timeout at the end of the game, and they didn't have one. So I'm pretty sure that they were told, the command center was just, just don't worry about it, or just, just end the game, just whatever, get the ball back and we'll start it out right now. Never got a penalty, never got whatever, right? Like, still got to figure out more of this. But there's these things that are just happening this year that are not shining on, a positive light on the command center, on officials. And yes, it's a difficult job. Yes, it's a tough job. But at the end of the day, to your point, Huss, the more plays that get called right, the better. And I'm putting in my full support behind a rules analyst every game.
Yeah, we need like a recently retired ref that comes in, given F levels are low, we'll call it as he sees it. That's fine.
Totally.
I mean, it would certainly add to the product overall. But as I said, bottom line is I'm a full proponent of replay in most situations. I'm here for more of it, but let's make sure upon review that we are getting the calls right. This is CFL 110 brought to you by Garage Living Winnipeg. Before we finish it up, let's take a quick look at the lines over with our friends at Coolbet. And how about this? Riders, 2.5-point road dogs against the Ottawa Red Blacks coming off the bye.
Jameer Thurman is out.
He is such a difference maker.
Especially for a defense, that guy's he might be one of the best defensive players in the league.
Ask Nick
right
Dembski about that.
Yeah,
that
totally.
play that he made a couple weeks ago. So Ottawa minus 164 on the money line. The Riders plus 135. One more game at least without Trevor Harris and Shea Paterson getting the start. Rematch between the Stamps and Argos. This time in Toronto. Calgary 0-4 on the road, 4-0 at home.
Argos all day, baby.
Yeah, Calgary's even money in this one. Argos minus 120 to win, and it is a 1-point spread at minus 110. As I said, until further notice, I will bet Calgary at home, and I will fade them on the road.
Quinton McManus is out, but Ormoladi's back in. So that's kind of a 1-for-1. Quinton McManus being out for Toronto is a big hit.
Ticats got nothing going at home against Montreal. Now they got to go to Montreal and do it. Alexander gets the start again for the Alouettes while Cody Fajardo rehabs his quad. Montreal 7.5-point favorites, the biggest favorite of the week in the Canadian Football League. And then the one that I know Michael and Connor were talking about it yesterday on WST. I get it that Vernon Adams is out. It still seems bizarre to be looking at BC at Edmonton, who just won their first game of the season, and the Elks are 1.5-point favorites at home. Minus 127.
Maybe Vegas is drunk on Trey Ford.
Hey, you know what? Somebody is. BC plus money at plus 105 to win. And man, can you imagine?
Them though, man. You saw them with Vernon Adams. To be in Edmonton, I don't know, man. I'm not overly surprised about that. Vernon Adams, the way the BC Lions go is the way the Vernon Adams goes. So it's.
And he's not coming to Edmonton. That's the game on the weekend. Of course, the Bombers chilling on the bye week. They're back in action next week with a trip to BC, and I believe that's a Sunday game. So a nice long break for the Bombers after that quick turnaround into that stunning 25-0 whitewash of the BC Lions that last week. Again, huge thanks to Garage Living Winnipeg for their support of CFL 110. If you want more information on what Garage Living can do to completely revolutionize and transform your garage, check them out online at garageliving.com and in the Winnipeg or Saskatchewan areas for more information on a free in-garage consultation to find out what is possible. Give our pal Pat Kanuga a call, 204-999-1234. Hammer, great stuff. Enjoy the rest of your travels. We'll see you back here in the Peg and next Wednesday right here on CFL 110.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Looking forward to doing it all again next week. Take care.
A big shout out to Michael Remus, working the ticker incredibly well as well on the program. If you are listening on the podcast, make sure to join us sometime if you're able to, right after Winnipeg Sports Talks on Wednesdays for the live edition on YouTube of CFL 110 as well. Again, thanks to Garage Living Winnipeg. Check them out at garageliving.com and 204-999-1234. For Jeff Hamilton, producer Michael Remus, I'm Andrew Paterson. Enjoy 4 big games in 3-down football this week, and we'll see you a week from now for another edition of CFL 110 right here on Winnipeg Sports Talk.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.